Ever wished you had your own personal Adobe Campaign Classic playground, a space to experiment without the risk of breaking anything in a live environment? Well, today we're diving into exactly that, setting up a local instance on your computer using Debian Linux.
It's like having a sandbox, but for marketing automation. A safe and free environment to learn the ropes, test ideas, and become a true campaign classic wizard.
I love that analogy.
Uh,
But before we start building castles in the sandbox, we need to lay the foundation right. And that's where Debian Linux comes in, running snugly inside a virtual machine.
yeah, you can think of a virtual machine like a computer within your computer. It lets you run a completely different operating system, in this case Debian Linux, without interfering with your main operating system.
It's like creating a separate world within your computer, with its own rules and configurations. And why Debian specifically?
Debian is known for its stability and its vast software repositories, which are like giant libraries of software. Plus, it's completely free to use. However, the principles we're discussing today apply to other Linux distributions, and the source material even mentions using Red Hat or even Windows if you prefer a visual interface.
Options are always good. So let's say we've got our virtual machine up and running with Debian. What's the next step in our Adobe Campaign quest?
It's time to gather our tools, which in this case means downloading the Adobe Campaign Classic server files. We'll need to venture into Adobe's Software Distribution Center, but there's a slight catch.
There's always a catch, isn't there? What do we need to get past this digital gatekeeper?
You'll need a valid Adobe ID that's linked to an existing Adobe Experience Cloud solution. It highlights a crucial aspect of technology. Access and resources are often intertwined.
It's like needing a library card to borrow those specialized power tools.
Okay.
Okay, assuming we've got our Adobe ID sorted, we can download the server files, carefully choosing the version that matches our Debian setup.
Exactly. Precision is key when it comes to software compatibility.
Now, we need a way to actually interact with Adobe Campaign, and that's where the client console comes in.
Think of the client console as your command center, the interface where you'll manage and orchestrate your campaigns. Windows users? You're in luck. The client console plays nicely with your operating system. But for those on a Mac, be prepared for a slight detour.
A detour.
Yeah.
Sounds intriguing. What kind of Mac-related adventures await us?
The source mentions a couple of options. You could run a virtual machine within your Mac to run Windows, essentially creating a Windows world inside your Mac world. Or you could explore remote desktop connections, which let you control a Windows machine from your Mac.
A bit like digital puppetry, controlling one computer from another.
Precisely. It just goes to show that even in the digital realm, there are always workarounds and creative solutions to bridge the gaps between different platforms.
I love how resourceful you have to be in the tech world. Okay, we've got our virtual machine, Debian Linux, the Adobe Campaign files, and a way to access it all. Now we get to the real nitty-gritty, the command line.
Ah, the command line. It might seem a bit intimidating at first, but think of it as a direct line of communication with your virtual machine, a way to give it instructions in its own language.
It's like learning a few secret phrases to unlock hidden features and powers.
Exactly. And the first two phrases you'll want to master are sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade.
Those sound serious. What kind of magic are we invoking with those commands?
Think of them as essential maintenance for your Debian system. Sudo apt update tells your system to check for any available updates for your software packages. It's like checking for new mail in your digital mailbox.
So it's like asking Debian, what's new? What have I missed?
Precisely. And once you've checked for updates, sudo apt upgrade tells your system to download and install those updates, ensuring you have the latest and greatest versions of everything.
It's like hitting the Update All button on your phone, making sure everything is running smoothly and securely.
Exactly. These simple commands are crucial, especially for troubleshooting later on.
And speaking of troubleshooting, the source mentioned running into a little hiccup with user permissions. It sounds like they had to do a bit of digital door unlocking to get full access to their system.
Right. It's a common snag, especially for those new to the world of Linux. They had to manually add their user account to something called the sudo group.
Sudo.
Yeah. Sudo stands for super user do, and it basically gives you elevated privileges to perform administrative tasks.
So without sudo privileges, you're like a guest in your own virtual house, unable to rearrange the furniture or change the thermostat.
Exactly. The command they used to fix it was sudo adducer username sudo.
So you just replace username with your actual username, and you're good to go.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to pay close attention to user permissions, especially when setting up a development environment where you'll be making lots of changes.
Security and permissions Always crucial. Now, I know we're focusing on Debian, but the source did mention a helpful tip for those using VirtualBox as their virtual machine software. Something about guest editions.
Ah, yes. Guest editions are like building a bridge between your virtual machine and your actual computer, allowing them to share files and resources more seamlessly.
So without guest editions, are we stuck emailing files back and forth between our virtual machine and our main computer?
Not quite, but it would be quite tedious. You'd have to manually transfer files, which can be time-consuming and error-prone, especially with larger files like the Adobe Campaign installation package.
Definitely not ideal.
Yeah.
So guest editions make our lives easier by streamlining that communication between the two worlds.
Exactly. It's a small step that can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Headaches avoided. I like
Yeah.
the sound of that. Okay, so we've got our virtual machine prep, Debian is ready to roll, and we've got our Adobe Campaign file standing by. Is it finally time to unleash the installation process?
We're almost there. But before we install Adobe Campaign, we need to set up a dedicated space for it to store all its important data, and that's where PostgreSQL comes in.
PostgreSQL. It sounds more like a mythical creature than a database.
It might sound intimidating, but trust me, it's a powerful open source database that plays perfectly with Adobe Campaign, and it's completely free to use. Think of it as the sturdy foundation upon which our Adobe Campaign castle will stand.
A solid foundation is crucial. How do we summon this PostgreSQL powerhouse into our virtual world?
Summoning PostgreSQL is as easy as using the command, well, it's sudo apt install PostgreSQL. These tells our Debian system to fetch it from the software repositories and install it for us.
That sounds almost too easy. Are there any hidden complexities we should be prepared for?
Well, like any good castle, PostgreSQL has layers of security, and its default settings can be a bit strict.
Strict in what sense?
By default, it relies on something called the peer authentication method. Imagine it as the castle guards assuming that anyone approaching with a familiar face is automatically a trusted guest. In technical terms, it expects your system username and PostgreSQL username to match.
So, no secret passwords or special handshakes needed. Just walk up and say, "It's me, Bob," and they wave you through.
In essence, yes. But for our Adobe Campaign setup, we'll want a more robust authentication system, something a bit more secure than just relying on usernames.
Right, because not everyone who looks friendly is actually there to help bake a cake.
Right.
Right, some might be after the secret recipe. So how do we bolster PostgreSQL's defenses?
We'll need to do a bit of configuration magic. There's a file called pghba.com. Think of it as the Castle Guard's instruction manual, where we can change the authentication method from peer to MD5.
MD5, is that some sort of secret code word?
It's a type of encryption that adds an extra layer of security by verifying your identity using a generated hash, like a digital fingerprint. It's more secure than just plain usernames.
So it's like giving PostgreSQL a pair of X-ray glasses to see through any disguises.
Precisely.
Now, I'm guessing changing this instruction manual requires some command line know-how. What incantation will we be using?
You'll use the sudo nano command, which is a text editor for the command line. This lets you open the file, make the change from peer to MD5, save it, and then tell PostgreSQL to reload those changes.
A few carefully typed words, and we've upgraded PostgreSQL security. But speaking of security, the source mentioned a rather common oversight that could leave our PostgreSQL castle vulnerable.
Ah, yes. It turns out they initially forgot to set a password for the default PostgreSQL user, which, rather confusingly, is also named Postgres.
Wait, so the user is named Postgres, and the database itself is PostgreSQL. Not very creative with the naming scheme, are they?
It can be a bit confusing, but more importantly, forgetting to set a password for this Postgres user is a major security risk.
It's like leaving the front gate to our castle wide open.
Precisely. To fix this, they had to temporarily tweak the authentication settings again, switching to something called ident authentication. It's like telling the castle guards, just this once, let anyone in as long as they can prove they're who they say they are according to our records.
So a temporary loosening of the rules to establish a more permanent security measure.
Exactly. With ident authentication enabled, they used password Postgres to set a password for the Postgres user directly from the PostgreSQL command line. Then they switched the authentication method back to the more secure MD5.
Security measures back in place. Much better. Okay, so we have our PostgreSQL database installed, configured with robust authentication, and secured with a strong password. What's the next step in our Adobe Campaign kingdom building?
Now it's time to create dedicated living quarters for our Adobe Campaign data and a loyal subject to manage it all.
You mean a user and a database?
Precisely. We wouldn't want our Adobe Campaign data mixing with the PostgreSQL Royal Court, right? For this all-important task, we'll use the command sudo ucrest creaser interactive to create a new user specifically for Adobe Campaign.
So we're creating a user account that will be responsible for managing our Adobe Campaign data within PostgreSQL.
Exactly. And of course, we'll set a strong password for this new user. Hopefully, this time we'll remember to write it down.
Absolutely, no more password amnesia.
Yeah.
But what about the database itself? How do we create that within PostgreSQL?
Another command line incantation. This time, we'll use sudo postgres created as a well database name, replacing database name with, well, a descriptive name for our database, like Adobe Campaign Data.
Straightforward and easy to remember. So
Sure.
we've got our PostgreSQL database, our dedicated user, and a secure password. What's next on our Adobe Campaign setup checklist?
Before we can open the doors to our Adobe Campaign kingdom, we need to make sure we have the right credentials and permissions to rule this digital realm. Specifically, we need to switch to the all-important Neolane user.
Neolane. What is this, some sort of secret society within Adobe Campaign?
Not quite a secret society, but you could think of it as the ruling class. Neolane is the user account that Adobe Campaign itself uses. It has all the necessary permissions to access the server files, interact with the database, and generally keep things running smoothly.
So we're assuming the identity of the Adobe Campaign overlord.
Exactly. And to do that, we'll use the command sudo su Neolane. It's like donning a royal robe, granting us the authority to issue commands and make changes on behalf of Adobe Campaign.
I love how we're weaving this whole kingdom analogy throughout our setup. It makes the process feel much more epic.
Indeed.
Okay, we've assumed the mantle of the Neolane user. What decrees are we issuing first?
Our first order of business is to create the Adobe Campaign instance itself. The source used a series of commands starting with enl server, which is the command line interface for managing Adobe Campaign. They created a new instance, giving it a descriptive name like Sandbox.
So we're literally building a sandbox for our marketing experiment.
Precise.
And did they set a password for this new Adobe Campaign instance? We don't want any rogue marketers sneaking in.
Absolutely. They used the enl server config internal password command to set a new password for the internal Adobe Campaign user. Remember, this is different from the Neolane system user we just discussed and the PostgreSQL user we set up earlier.
Okay, so that's 3 passwords we're juggling already. The Neolane system user, the PostgreSQL database user, and now this internal Adobe Campaign user. It's like a game of digital lock and key.
You're getting the hang of it.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of strong, unique passwords and, ideally, a good password manager to keep track of them all.
Agreed. Any other essential commands we should add to our Adobe Campaign spellbook before we forget?
The source emphasized the command enl server config reload. This is like hitting the refresh button on your Adobe Campaign configuration after making any changes.
So reload after changes. Got it. What else?
They also highlighted enl server watchdog-svc-no console, which is what you use to start the Adobe Campaign instance, and enl server pdump, which lets you peek at all the Adobe Campaign processes currently running. It's a bit like checking the heartbeat of our Adobe Campaign instance.
It's reassuring to know we can check on our instance and make sure everything is running smoothly. But knowing our track record with this setup, I have a feeling there were more surprises in store, right?
You know me too well. Turns out, even with all the commands executed flawlessly, those pesky configuration files often need a little extra attention.
Of course they do. No tech project is complete without a few unexpected twists and turns. What kind of configuration conundrums did they encounter this time?
First, they had to point Adobe Campaign in the right direction by updating the database connection information in a configuration file located in the local neolan and l6conf directory. This file tells Adobe Campaign where to find our PostgreSQL database, which user to connect as, and what password to use.
It's like giving Adobe Campaign a detailed map to the PostgreSQL castle.
Precisely. But that wasn't all. Remember those essential Adobe Campaign services we talked about earlier? Like the stat service for collecting statistics and the rough server for managing workflows.
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Think of them as essential services that keep our Adobe Campaign kingdom running smoothly. Well, it turns out they had to be manually enabled within the configuration file.
So it's not enough to have these services available. We need to explicitly tell Adobe Campaign to use them.
Exactly.
And speaking of essential services, what about email? That's kind of a big deal for marketing campaigns, right?
Absolutely. However, in this particular setup, since we're primarily focused on building a local development environment, the source decided to disable the email server section in the configuration file. They weren't planning on sending any real emails from this instance, so it made sense from a security and resource management perspective.
It's like building a beautiful, fully functional car, but deciding to leave it on blocks in the garage for now because we're still working on our driver's license.
A very apt analogy.
Okay, so we've tackled database connections, enabled essential services, and even decided to temporarily disable email functionality. What's the next challenge on our Adobe Campaign quest?
Now comes the crucial part, making sure we can actually connect to our newly configured Adobe Campaign instance from our main computer. It's time to tackle the sometimes treacherous world of networking.
Because what good is a digital marketing playground if we can't get through the front gates?
Exactly.
So far, we've navigated user permissions, database configurations, and even dabbled in the art of Adobe Campaign incantations. But networking often trips people up. What kind of digital hurdles did the source encounter?
It all started with NAT, the default networking mode for virtual machines. Think of it like your virtual machine living in a building with a single shared address. While it works for basic internet access, it can make it tricky for your main computer to find and talk to your virtual machine directly.
It's like trying to send a letter to your friend's apartment when you only have the building address, no apartment number.
Exactly. To solve this, they switched to bridged networking mode. Now, imagine that your virtual machine gets its own unique address on the network, just like giving it its own apartment in the building.
So no more getting lost in the virtual mailroom. How do we switch to this bridged mode? Is it a complicated procedure?
It's usually just a setting within your virtual machine software. Once they made the switch, they used the command Apadra show to find their virtual machine's new IP address. Think of it like looking up your friend's new apartment number.
Okay, so we've bridged the virtual divide and can connect to our Adobe Campaign instance. What's next in turning this instance into a fully operational marketing fortress?
Every good fortress needs a secure front gate, and that's where a web server comes in. While optional, integrating a web server like Apache opens up a world of possibilities for interacting with your Adobe Campaign instance.
So it's like adding a grand entrance to our Adobe Campaign castle, complete with drawbridge and portcullis.
I like the way you think. A web server handles things like file uploads, web-based forms, and other interactions between the outside world and your Adobe Campaign instance.
It's like the official spokesperson for our Adobe Campaign kingdom, handling all the communication with the outside world.
Precisely. The source opted for Apache, a popular and reliable open-source web server. Installing it is as simple as using the command sudo apt install Apache 2.
Simple, you say. I've learned to be wary of that word when it comes to command line adventures.
You're right to be cautious. While the installation itself was straightforward, they did have to do some cleanup work afterward, specifically disabling a bunch of default Apache modules.
Modules, are those like extra features or add-ons for Apache?
Exactly. Think of them as optional components that extend Apache's functionality. However, not all modules play nicely with Adobe Campaign, and some can even pose security risks if not configured properly.
So it's like inheriting a castle with a bunch of extra rooms you don't need and might even be dangerous, so you seal them off for safety.
Precisely. They used the command aid2dismod, followed by the module name, to disable each one, ensuring that Apache was lean, mean, and compatible with Adobe Campaign.
Okay, so we've streamlined our web server for maximum compatibility. What's next on our security checklist?
The source strongly emphasized the importance of adding SSL certificates, especially if you plan to access your Adobe Campaign instance from anywhere other than your local network.
SSL certificates. Those are like digital badges of authenticity and security, right?
Exactly. An SSL certificate encrypts the communication between your browser and the web server, making it much harder for any malicious actors to intercept or eavesdrop on sensitive information.
It's like adding a layer of unbreakable encryption to all messages entering and leaving our Adobe Campaign kingdom.
Precisely. The source opted for Let's Encrypt, a fantastic service that provides free and automated SSL certificates.
Free and automated security. Sign me up.
To get started, they installed CertBot, a tool specifically designed to obtain and install Let's Encrypt certificates.
Right.
Using the command, it's sudo apt-get install certbot python 3 certbot apache. Once installed, certbot did all the heavy lifting, automatically fetching the certificate for their domain name and even configuring Apache to use it.
That's what I call a user-friendly security solution. Okay, we have our web server configured, our SSL certificate in place. Is it finally time to open the doors to our Adobe Campaign instance?
Almost there. There's one final hurdle the source had to clear, and it involves those security zones we talked about earlier. Remember how Adobe Campaign has some strict rules about who can access what?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
By default, Adobe Campaign assumes you're connecting from a very trusted network. To get around this, they had to temporarily loosen the security settings for the internal Adobe Campaign user, allowing them to connect from their host machine without getting blocked. But they emphasized that it's crucial to revert these security settings back to their more restrictive defaults once the initial configuration is done.
Safety first. So with that final security tweak in place, can we finally fire up the Adobe Campaign Client Console?
Absolutely. It's time to run the first-time instance configuration wizard, which guides us through the essential setup steps, like confirming database connections, setting time zones, and choosing which Adobe Campaign packages to install.
Packages. Is that like choosing the furniture and decor for our Adobe Campaign Castle?
Exactly. We get to decide which features we want to enable, tailoring it to our specific needs. And of course, we'll be asked to set a password for the admin user, yet another layer of security for our kingdom.
Okay, I'm making a note. Admin password. Let's see, that's password number 4, right?
That's right. It's a lot to keep track of, which is why a password manager is an invaluable tool for any aspiring Adobe Campaign wizard.
Agreed. So with the wizard's guidance, we've crossed the final frontier in our Adobe Campaign Classic setup journey. We've laid the groundwork, built our fortress, secured the perimeter, and now we're ready to explore the vast and powerful world within.
And the best part is that this is just the beginning. This setup is your personal sandbox for exploration and experimentation. The source author even hinted at plans to delve into more advanced configurations in the future, so your journey doesn't have to end here.
There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more campaigns to create. Thank you for being our guide on this epic Adobe Campaign adventure. Till next time, happy campaigning.